Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to What the Fuck Have We Done? Pigeoncast's UK-based discussion show. My name is Rat, and I welcome you to today's episode, which is the second episode of my podcast. On today's episode, we'll be covering a topic which is very close to my heart as someone who studies biology. So I'm going to be talking about species extinction and species reintroduction. I'm hoping that you will all find this topic as interesting as I do. So, I will now open with our little topic recap section. So, we as human beings are part of an incredibly diverse world that is positively teeming with thousands of different species that range all the way from bacteria to actual blue whales. Unfortunately, that does mean that the species we share our planet with have also fallen victim to the effects of things like climate change or just general pollution, things like that, which has unfortunately had the effect of leading to the absolutely heartbreaking, in my opinion, loss of various species in our world. And these extinctions have included a great many different species, including the more iconic ones such as the Tasmanian tiger or the Chinese whitefin dolphin, with many other species which are sometimes lesser known, such as the vaquita, or the Bornean orangutan, or the Sunda tiger, being critically endangered and at the risk of extinction. However, of course, it's not all doom and gloom, as we have seen recent efforts in several countries that have seen successful reintroduction of some species into their natural habitats. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, both the downsides and the upsides of our human impact on the species that we share our world with. So, for the first part of our main topic today, I'm going to just sort of identify and roughly explain the main factors that can contribute to a species actually going extinct. Some of the ones I've decided to cover includes habitat loss, resource availability, and overpredation. So, habitat loss usually comes about as a result of something such as pollution or deforestation, making the area uninhabitable. And these factors are usually due to an outside influence, which in our current world usually tends to be a human influence or an anthropogenic influence, if you want to get into the science of it all. And this factor is probably the most destructive out of all of them, as it does involve the actual wiping out of whole areas. And a very good example of this factor would be perhaps deforestation in the Amazon rainforest for things such as paper milling or livestock farming. Though, of course, it's important to note that it's not always the fault of people, as things such as freak wildfires or severe storms can also contribute to the severe damaging of a habitat to the point where it can no longer be inhabited. But it's not all doom and gloom when it does come to this, as the impact that we as humans have can be reduced by looking for eco-friendly or rainforest-friendly alternatives to products, such as using bamboo paper instead of wood pulp paper, or going for things that don't contain palm oil, those sorts of things, which you can find in a lot of shops nowadays. And that leads me quite nicely into the next little factor I want to talk about today, which is resource availability, because it does sort of tie in with habitat loss. So, resource availability, in its simplest terms, refers to how available the necessities for life are for a species. So that could be the amount of space to live, the amount of food that's available, the amount of water that's available, and the overall nutrients that are within that food bracket. The easiest kind of chain of events to look at in terms of this is a lack of space will lead to less food and water availability, which will then lead to the decline of an available population of a species. And this is sort of something that can be referred to as negative pressure. which will cause a decline and can, in some cases, lead to the eventual extinction of a species. This too can be avoided by a reduction in the pressure put on a habitat, so allowing natural resources to replenish so that a species that is native to the area is able to get what they need in order to survive. A very good example of this is sustainable fishing instead of bulk fishing or trawl fishing, which ensures that populations of fish are able to remain stable and continue reproducing while still allowing us humans to get the fish we want at market. The most common practice of this is actually the sort of measuring of lobsters. So you've got keeper lobsters, which you can keep to eat, and throwbacks, which you have to put back into the population to continue breeding, which is a really, really good way of maintaining food supplies and populations in a balance. And that actually leads quite well into the final factor regarding extinction that I want to talk about today. Partly because every time I say the words overpredation when talking about it, people will sometimes think I'm talking about some kind of bizarre apex predator that has miraculously appeared in an ecosystem to wreak havoc. When in reality, I'm actually talking about the relationships contained within an ecosystem. So sometimes overpredation occurs because humans are hunting an animal for sport or hunting an animal that species might rely on in terms of food into decline and into extinction, which will then have sort of a knock-on effect through the ecosystem. Or sometimes it can happen where an invasive species gets into an ecosystem and wreaks absolute havoc on the native population, because the native population isn't used to that invasive species being there. And in quite a bizarre turn of events, we have seen that happen before here in the UK in the New Forest, where in the 90s, accidentally, a group of invasive mink were released and proceeded to completely decimate the population of native water vole. And the funny part of that is it was actually the fault of a group of very well-meaning people who released the mink from a fur farm without thinking of the impact the mink would have on the local populations. So now I've given you a quick summary of the doom and gloom part of everything and how the previous factors I mentioned going unchecked can contribute to a species going extinct because of a non-viable population. I thought it would be important now to talk about the way we are beginning to undo the damage that we have done in terms of habitat destruction, etc. And that is through a process known as reintroduction and rewilding, which tends to involve instances where we take a previously extinct species or a species very similar to it and release it back into a habitat in order to help kind of get things going again. The most iconic of these programs is one a fair few people are familiar with, which was the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in America, which was a rewilding effort so successful that it has produced not only a thriving wolf population, but it has also revitalized the ecosystems within Yellowstone because it helps keep the herbivore populations managed, so the populations of deer and things like that are now being kept under control naturally. And it was actually this method of reintroduction and rewilding that has inspired some projects which are currently in consideration here in the UK, which are some projects to reintroduce wolves, bears, and lynx back into the UK's wild zones. The UK's actually had a few projects of its own already start to happen as well, because recently we have had European bison reintroduced into a controlled area of forest in Kent, in order to observe their behaviour and analyse the effects their presence may have on the surrounding habitats. Alongside this project, we've also seen the successful reintroduction of water vole into the New Forest, following the removal of the invasive mink I mentioned earlier in today's episode. It's taken about 30 years to get rid of all those mink. These rewilding and reintroduction efforts are incredibly important and are absolutely paving the way for a new version of the captive breeding and release programs that a lot of zoos have been running for endangered species. And we have recognized the efforts that have gone into these things, and we are working so hard to fix the problems that we have caused over the years. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is a lot of hope out there for our endangered species. And so, on that slightly happier note, as I did with last episode, I'm now going to mention a bit of how we as individuals can help contribute to this repairing of our ecosystems and of our world. And so, the most obvious one is that I recommend trying to buy reusable or recyclable products instead of disposable landfill products, which will help kind of prevent overconsumption of resources in some areas. Selecting fair trade food or rainforest safe food rather than going for kind of sketchier products. And also offering your time or donations to groups such as WWF, the Worldwide Wildlife Foundation, that make efforts towards protecting habitats and re-releasing endangered species. It's very important to note that little things go a long way when everyone is making a little bit of effort, and I encourage you to think of what you might be able to do. And so that marks the end of today's little episode of What the Fuck Have We Done? I hope that you have all enjoyed listening to me talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I hope that I've given you a good starting point in understanding this topic. So, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to be back with you soon to provide you with a little bit more content about the world we live in. Rat, signing out.